This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And so I want to give a special thank you to Stephen Byrne and Eve England, who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon, and to Carl Watson, who just made a one-time contribution to the show via PayPal. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 399 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the new Netflix series The Witcher, based on the novels by Andrzej Sapkowski, and this will involve spoilers for all of Season 1, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So first up, we've got Anthony Ha, making his 17th appearance on the show. He covers media, advertising, and pop culture for the news site TechCrunch, where he also hosts the podcast's original content. A chapbook of his short stories called Love Songs for Monsters was published by Youth in Decline in 2014, and his short story Late Train appeared in the February 2019 issue of Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet. So, Anthony, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Then next up, we've got Andrea Kail, making her 11th appearance on the show. She's a graduate of the Odyssey Writers Workshop, and her short fiction appears in the Writers of the Future anthology, Fantasy Magazine, and Lightspeed. She's the former script supervisor for Late Night with Conan O'Brien, and is currently a staff writer at WWE's Friday Night SmackDown. So, Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
And also joining us today is Gillian Conahan. She's a professional costumer, former editor of Vogue Patterns magazine, and author of the book The Hero's Closet, Sewing for Cosplay and Costuming. Her writing has also appeared in Discover and Apex magazines, and she won first prize in the cosplay contest at Keystone Comic-Con 2019 for playing Ciri from The Witcher 3. So, Gillian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's start off with Anthony, and have you just tell us about what sort of expectations did you have going into Netflix's The Witcher?
I went in with pretty close to zero expectations. I had heard of the video games and knew that they were a big deal, but had never played them. And again, I'd sort of followed a little bit of the run up to the series, particularly, the casting of Henry Cavill, the question of whether or not, what role that may have played in, his continuing or not continuing to be Superman. But I mean, this was all sort of just like vague background noise to me. I had never read the books, never played the games. And so I went into it almost entirely fresh. I think a friend of mine had seen some of the screeners for some of the first few episodes early. So he told me that it was pretty silly, and I don't think that was an inaccurate assessment, but I went in with low expectations, and I would say, not to jump too far ahead, but I think I exceeded them pretty healthily.
How about Andrea? Any expectations going into The Witcher?
Absolutely none. I also had no experience of the books or the games. I'm not a gamer, so I had heard of them, but that was the extent of it. So it was just my expectations were for seeing Henry Cavill in a tight shirt, and those expectations were exceeded, shall we say. The hair, on the other hand, but that's a whole other thing. But in any case, I knew nothing about the show, anything about it. So, went in blind, so to speak.
Yeah, so like you guys, I'm sort of aware of the games, but I've never played them, and I knew that they were based on this series of books by a Polish author, but I've never read them, so I had no real expectations on that account. And but when I saw the trailer, I thought the trailer looked like it had a much bigger budget than I had been imagining. And so that got me kind of interested in the show. And then how about Gillian? We've got a ringer here who does know a lot about the books and the game. So what sort of expectations did you have going into the TV show?
Oh boy. So I played The Witcher 3. I spent about 2 years playing through, hitting every single side quest, every single map icon. And I had read all the books last year. So my expectations going into the show, I pretty much felt like this could be really good or really bad.
Mhm.
The books are very much kind of a stock sword and sorcery. There are a lot of things to like about them. There's also a lot of what I would call sexist set dressing. A lot of characters getting their shirts ripped off for no reason. It's a time. And the game is kind of a parallel continuity, and it's a lot of the same characters, a lot of the same events, and especially the same backstory. But it kind of takes a very different perspective on the whole thing. And I think because I played the game first, I enjoyed the books more, because I was already attached to the characters. So I felt going into the show that it could be the kind of stuff you can't stand to watch because it's like a bad sword and sorcery show, or it could be more like the game in that it's has the humor, it has does more to develop the characters and to present the world in a more structured way, I guess is what I want to say.
Yeah, well, why don't you... I mean, you said you read all the books, and my understanding is that there's like 2 short story collections and then like another 7 or so novels after that. Is that right?
I think there might be 7 or 8 total, including the short story collections.
Okay.
The show is mostly based on the 2 short story collections. And you can identify specific short stories that became episodes of the show. But for example, Yennefer's entire backstory is a couple of paragraphs in one of the short stories. So they pulled 2 entire episodes of show out of a very thin amount of material in the books.
Yeah, and so I hadn't realized watching the show, I thought the books were more recent, that they were sort of from the mid-2000s, which is when they were published in English, but they were apparently originally published in Polish, starting in like 1986 or something. I think I have it here. But so they really have much more of the flavor of kind of 80s sword and sorcery fantasy than I was expecting. Do you agree with that they have sort of an 80s, the books have sort of an 80s vibe?
Yeah. There is a lot of that.
Yeah. So then the one thing that sort of lowered my expectations a lot going into this is that a lot of my friends were posting, and especially like I had a bunch of friends who were fans of the books and or the games who said that they gave up on the show after the first episode. So that, but then I had other people who said, oh, it's enjoyable. So I wasn't sure exactly what to expect. But I guess I would. Well, how about let's go back to Anthony. Just what was your reaction when you actually sat down and watched episode 1?
It was, I would say, fairly mixed because I thought the Geralt storyline, which, if I recall correctly, is most of that episode, was pretty generic. So it shows him first kind of, I guess, monster killing, which is fun, but then focuses on this. He gets pulled into this intrigue with this wizard named Stragobor, and he wants to kill this woman named Renfrey. And I just found that storyline not compelling at all. And I'm not entirely sure why that was, but it just felt like I wasn't interested in any of those characters. I felt like Geralt in those early stages is just this very kind of stoic hero. And I found the other storyline.
Let me jump in there because it's funny because I was watching it with the subtitles on, and so like half of his dialogue is just like and it's just like every time it just says like at the bottom of the screen. So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, so there's a second storyline that's about Princess Cirilla and this kingdom, and I found that again like not incredibly even that wasn't like an amazing piece of storytelling, but I found that considerably more compelling. and about this sort of invasion from this kingdom called Nilfgaard. But what I really liked about it was the relationship between Cirilla and her grandmother, and then this sort of father figure who's married to her grandmother, but is not actually her grandfather. And that stuff was really where I found kind of more promising and interesting. And then how quickly, that storyline accelerates to the point where, their kingdom has fallen and Cirilla is, fleeing and captured. And so I would say that at that point I was like, I'm not crazy about this show. I like enough of it that I'm willing to keep going. But I think that, looking back, that the first episode the first two episodes maybe are the weakest of the show.
Yeah. How about Andrea? What were your response to the first episode?
I didn't have that gut response of, oh, this is fantastic, I gotta keep watching it. It was pleasant and entertaining enough that I went on to the second episode and the third episode, but it wasn't gripping. But it got better for me, and the thing that struck me, and I think I might have said this to you at some point, was that it's a lot more episodic than I thought it would be, because I had no idea what this was. I knew it was novels, but I had no idea it was based on short stories. Totally made sense once I found out that it was short stories that it was based on. But I think they did for me aside from Henry Cavill, a really good job of making me like the characters. And that's what I was sticking around for. So that was my impression. And that's how I ended up watching the whole thing, and how I ended up really, at the end of the day, really enjoying it.
Yeah. Well, I'll say I ended up, not to get too far ahead, but yeah, I ended up liking it just fine. So I'm going to say some negative stuff about it. So Witcher fans, don't tune out yet if you want to hear me say more positive things as we go. But yeah, I honestly probably, if I wasn't watching this show to review it, I honestly probably would have turned it off. I definitely would have turned it off during the first episode. It's just a question of how far into the first episode I would have gotten. It's entirely possible I would have turned it off after the first scene, which is this he's fighting this giant CGI spider, and it's just totally ridiculous.
Terrible. It's terrible. It looked terrible.
But so, and also, I was a little I was expecting, just knowing that it was based on some books, I was expecting it to be a little bit more serious and a little bit more literate, a little bit more in the Game of Thrones kind of arena. And I know, obviously I like fantasy, and there's a certain amount of, they're going to just mention all these names and everything that you're not going to know, and you just have to accept that. But even granting that, I found a lot of the stuff completely incomprehensible. And throughout, especially the first 3 or 4 episodes, I was just constantly pausing it and saying, I must have missed something, because this scene just seems like a complete non sequitur. I must have missed something. And I would go back, I'm like, no, I didn't miss anything. This just makes no sense, or just doesn't flow logically to me in any way. So Andrea, you're saying,
Oh yeah, I agree with all of it. I did the exact same thing. I would stop, I would rewind, and I'd be like, did I miss what they're talking about? And I'd play it again. I'm like, no, this is just the most obscure, vague dialogue. I have no idea what these people are talking about. And I think the biggest problem I had with it overall in that regard is that I had no idea how any of this magic worked, and they never really explained it. There's no definition to any of the magic. He drinks some kind of potion that makes him stronger, but it's just it's not introduced in a way that feels natural. It's just not introduced at all. He just does it. So that was, my basic, biggest concern with it was that the dialogue is all a little vague. The magic's a little vague. But I feel weird saying this, because at the end of the day, I actually enjoyed watching it, but yeah.
But yeah, and like I'm saying, it's not just that they're like, Nilfgaard is doing this, and I don't know what Nilfgaard is. That's just par for the course with fantasy. But it's all of a sudden he's killing all these thugs in the town square, and I'm not really sure why, or what's going. It's just very mundane, practical aspects of the plot are totally opaque to me, not just the world building.
I think that was something that very much suffered from the translation to television. in the short story, it's heavily implied that there's additional information going into that fight. Geralt has heard from other people that Renfri's thugs were involved in a massacre of some large number of people on a previous occasion. So he thinks that he's preventing the entire town from being massacred, as that's being presented in the short story. Whereas I think in the show, they don't communicate that, and that's a decision that I think makes Geralt come off rather poorly.
I mean, so Gillian, so as you're watching this, having read the story, did it seem like it made sense to you with your background knowledge, or were you thinking like this doesn't make sense? As you're watching it?
And going back a minute, a lot of the dialogue that's making references to other characters and events is actually very pointed. And it's the sort of thing that I think would be very hard to pick up on if you're not looking for it and expecting it. For example, Renfri drops a line about, at my age, Queen Calanthe just won her first battle, or something like that, and which is grounding us in the timeline. And that's telling us where this story is taking place relative to the princess's storyline. But if you think that's a throwaway line and you're not paying attention, then you're not going to get that crucial piece of information, which makes it difficult, I think.
Well, I picked up probably around the third episode that it was separate timelines. But when I watched the first episode the second time, I caught that line and I'm like, oh, it was right there. But that's the sort of thing you can miss so easily. Not that that's a bad thing, but the timeline thing never bothered me. It's other things that
I think it's a bad thing. I mean, I think if you're like you think that all these events, so basically, so there's three main characters: Geralt, this princess Cirilla, and this sorceress Yennefer, and it basically cuts between their stories and spends about an equal amount of time on each one. And at least for me, it seemed like these events were happening contemporaneously. And I found it extraordinarily annoying several episodes into the show when it turns out that these stories are all, like one is happening, it must be like 30 years before the others. And then one is happening, I guess Geralt's story is sort of leading up to Cirilla's story, right? So she's in the future from his point of view. But I think that drove me crazy. I think there must have been a better way to handle that.
And I think if you're coming in as a fan of the books or the games, you do know that those have a general idea of how those timelines work. So that's probably a key difference in the reception the show's been getting.
I would also say that, I mean, for me, it was actually incredibly pleasurable to like have that surprise come in the third episode where I don't know when it was for you guys, but to me, there's like a very distinct moment where maybe there are clues like in the preceding episodes that you could figure it out, but, where you meet a character, this king, as an adult, and then you realize in a different storyline that you're seeing him as a child.
Yes.
And to me, that was like, whoa, like now, like I completely reconfigures how I understand how this story fits together. And I thought that was great. Like that was something that I really loved. And again, I mean, that doesn't mean that I it didn't make me retroactively like those early episodes more, but as a twist, I found that really satisfying. And I would also say that, I mean, I'm hesitant to talk too much about this because I think it's sort of a spoiler for a different book, but there is a very popular Hugo Award-winning novel that came out in the past decade that employs a very similar strategy that I think is also is an example of how this can work really well.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, how did you react to Westworld?
I hated it. I was totally confused the whole time.
Okay.
And I think it's just too confusing, and especially like when you meet the king as a kid, especially since it's in this fantasy world. It's like, wait, is this like an illusion? Is this like, a doppelganger? Is it like it's time travel? Like it could be anything, and it's not like, and it's not like Back to the Future or something where you can tell like, oh, this is the 50s and this is the 80s because the clothes are different. Like all the characters, all the clothing in a time period all seems the same. And also, I might even be getting this wrong, but I feel like Geralt appears in his own story and appears in Cirilla's story, and you can't tell which one it is. Like a scene might open with Geralt like looking off into the horizon, and you don't know whether it's in his story or her story or like what year it was. It's just like I feel like okay, I have two ideas about how this should have been handled. So one would be to just like start off in a time period where they're all there and introduce the characters, and then have flashbacks to Yennefer's story and Geralt's story. And then the other thing I think might have worked is to just not mix the stories all together within the episodes, but have certain episodes that are just Geralt stories, and then interspersed with those are episodes that are just Cirilla stories or just Yennefer stories. And I feel like if there was a whole episode where it's like, this is what happened to Cirilla after she fled the city, if I realized that this was not taking place in the same time frame as the Geralt stories, that would be less irritating to me. If it's like its own episode, it would be easier for me to separate it and not get confused when we're constantly switching back and forth.
So as a slight caveat to that, I would point out that I believe that Geralt doesn't actually appear in any of the other timelines, except maybe towards maybe the last episode or two where the timelines kind of catch up to each other. But he's mentioned a lot, so it is confusing in the sense that he's being talked about a lot in the Cirilla timeline. But he doesn't act. He's actually off screen for reasons that we find out later on in terms of him being kind of chasing in prison and then injured, and so he doesn't if you see Geralt, it is in his timeline. But I do understand why that was still confusing.
Well, I don't know. Do you count episode 4 as the end of the show, because we do see him there 6 years, something like that, before Ciri's timeline?
Well, it's confusing because that's still in the Geralt timeline, right? That's just when his storyline intersects with and gives context for the Cirilla timeline. But technically, it's not a fast forward. That's just continuing to follow.
Anthony,
I mean, that's part of why it's
totally
confusing.
Zoned out on what you're saying. This is why. It's
Fine. I think I'm just saying there are rules to how they show it.
Kills spiders with a sword. It's not like quantum physics. It should be like. It should be pretty easy to follow.
I guess here's how I would explain it, and I think it does follow these rules, is just that if you see Yennefer, it's distant past. If you see Geralt, it's recent past, and if you see Ciri, it's quote unquote present of the story. And then towards the last episode or two, it starts to bend those rules because they're catching up to each other. But until then, I mean, I'm not saying it's not confusing, but I'm just saying there is an internal logic to how they show it.
Yeah, I think I see what you mean in that each of the separate timelines does proceed chronologically within that timeline.
Yes.
But
then they intersect with each other in confusing ways.
I'm detecting a lack of enthusiasm for my ideas about having individual episodes devoting to Cirilla's story and Yennefer's story.
Well, I had no problem with the differing timelines altogether. The minute I realized it, I was fine with it. I didn't find it confusing. And I thought it's a different way to present it. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was a interesting little twist, personally.
All right. Well, it seems like I'm in
I think we do see the story suffering from trying to pack too much into each episode. I'm thinking of when Geralt's talking to the elves, and that's a very rushed, abbreviated bit of dialogue that has to cross a lot of distance, and I don't think that works very well. They come around from, we're going to kill you, to, oh, maybe you're right, maybe we should... I don't even know what the conclusion they come to there is, because I feel like that, as a bit of dialogue, did not do what it needed to do.
Yeah, I also had a serious case of elf whiplash at that part where I was like, wait, there's elves in this story? Like, this somebody could have mentioned that earlier. Like, and a lot of fantasy movies, they start out with, it's like, in the beginning, the elves created like whatever, and you sort of see watching this why they do that, even though it seems a little hokey sometimes. It's like, oh, okay, at least now I know. I knew in the first minute of the show that there's like elves in this world and like whatever magic, like whatever's, and it's like I think it's really important in fantasy, since anything could happen, to establish as clearly and as quickly as possible what's possible in this world. Like Andrea was saying, kind of with the magic. Like, I mean, obviously you can't establish everything, but like you can mention elves like right at the beginning if elves are like one of the main races that are political factions in this world.
I agree with that in the sense that I do think that so much of that elf storyline seemed interesting in theory, but because they were so determined to, it felt like the whole thing was just compressed into 20 minutes of this episode which also introduces Yennefer, which also advances, some of the other storylines. And so it was like we went from, hey, there are elves. Here's this, terrible history of how the elves were nearly wiped out. And then now we're introducing elves, and now we're wrapping up the elf storyline. And that all happened so quickly and just did not make any impact at all for me.
It puts a lot of weight on Geralt's stirring speech, which I think is not actually good enough to justify that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, so I watched this. After I watched the show, I found this YouTube video. It's called How to Fail at Adaptation, The Witcher. And the title sounds pretty harsh. The actual video isn't quite as harsh. But and it's really good, I think. But he points out that the storyline, the first episode with the Stregobor and Renfri and all that, and the Hedgehog Knight guy showing up at the royal party, that, as Gillian was sort of saying a little bit too, that like so much of those stories was left out that they're just completely incomprehensible. And once he explains what actually happens in the short story, you're kind of like, oh, all right, that actually makes perfect sense. And so I think this is why it might have been a better idea to have dedicated Geralt episodes, or at least like, 45 minutes of Geralt and then 15 minutes of somebody else, so that you got, because a lot of those Geralt things, so much is going on in them that gets left out, that it just key pieces are missing. And also I felt like Cirilla's story, a lot of it could have been cut, like, because basically like the castle gets sacked and she runs off into the woods and meets Geralt, right? And then everything else that happens, it seems, my impression as a first-time viewer, is not actually that essential to the plot. The whole thing with the elf Dara that follows her around, the whole thing where they go to like the Amazon forest, the whole thing where she gets like adopted by the farmer woman. It seems like you could just cut all that stuff out and it wouldn't really make any difference. And you could use that time to fill in some of these explanatory exposition things that are really necessary to just basically understand some of these self-contained stories.
I think also go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I see your point there. And yes, she doesn't advance much as a character. We just see her running around. What we really need to know about her is that she has this weird screaming power, which could be done quickly. I wish I had seen more of her evolve. She basically spends most of the time learning stuff.
And a lot of what she's learning is kind of the undoing her rosy vision of her grandmother's reign.
Right.
She knew her grandmother as a grandmother, but her grandmother was also a very violent ruler, and one who possibly encouraged a lot of really nasty attitudes among her subjects.
Yeah.
So you think, Gillian, that all that stuff had to be, that all like sets up her character, or do you think that any of it could have been cut out?
It pains me to say this because Ciri is actually one of my favorite characters. Honestly, most of what's interesting about her comes much later. I think that we do need to see kind of the underbelly of Calanthe's rule. We need to see, the breaking of those illusions, but I don't think we needed to see them at such length. And I think that of the three storylines, that one is probably the weakest. And I hate saying that because she's one of my favorite characters further down the line. Yeah,
I mean, that's your cosplay champion character.
Right. Right. But most of what I like about Ciri is much later in the story, and this is why I'm crossing my fingers real hard that we get 3, 4, 5 seasons of this. Because the best Ciri stuff is definitely still to come.
Yeah, and I guess we'll just say that this has 100% been renewed for season 2, so it's just a question of whether it'll go beyond that. But yeah, so I have with these 3 stories in my notes. I have this. I thought the Ciri story had a lot of extraneous stuff in it. Geralt I thought was fun but dumb, and then Yennefer. This Yennefer storyline was by far my favorite, and I thought that was the most interesting, in terms of both her development as a character and all the sort of political machinations with the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, whatever it was called. Yeah. So does everyone, Anthony, what do you think about that?
I would say that's my assessment as well. I mean, I think there are things with Yennefer's story also that are, that I don't think everything about it was great. And I think there's definitely some stuff to talk about in terms of both how the show treats her, initial, disability, and then also, how so much of what comes later is motivated by her desire for a child. And so I don't think like it's totally like I only liked Yennefer and didn't like Ciri at all, but I would say that's a fair sort of ranking of the 3.
How about Andrea?
Yes, I did like Yennefer quite a bit. I was super annoyed by the whole I want a baby thing. At one point I remember she said something about she wasn't given the choice to not lose her womb or uterus. But I mean, she was given that choice. She just, like, you did have the choice. You made the choice. So stop moaning. And also, why does she feel the need to personally have a baby? Like, do you really need to have your own baby? Can't you just, it's this medieval society with, I would assume, a corresponding childbirth mortality rate. I assume there's like orphan infants all over the place.
Probably a higher mortality rate since they have giant spiders running around.
So, right. So you can't just go take a baby or steal a baby or a sorceress. Just go steal a baby.
This is setup. This is setup.
Yeah, that was the thing that annoyed me about it. But overall, I liked the character. She's cynical. She's angry. That's my wheelhouse for a female character. So I did like her a lot. I did like Geralt, grunting and, saying fuck all the time. So, but.
I think it's interesting that the 2 main things that people have picked up on not liking about Yennefer are pretty much all we get about her in the short stories. Mm-hmm. We get maybe a paragraph total about that she was born and disabled and undisabled herself with magic, and that I think the story the dragon came from also mentions that she wants a baby. And really a lot of the other stuff we get about Yennefer has been invented for the show. And I think that, sorry.
No, I was going to say which parts, just.
Her background at Aretuza, I think that her arc in the show is about undoing her early programming. From what we see of what she's being taught to use people. She's being taught to value power above all else. And she's being taught that any sacrifice is worth it in order to have power. So when she later says, well, I made choices that I now regret, I think that she was making those choices in a state that was programmed by her education. And over the course of the show, I think that she is unlearning what she's been taught.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning. I mean, like Anthony was saying that there's sort of problematic aspects of, but I feel like this show is like problematic, or sort of like politically insensitive in pretty much along every axis. Whether it's disability, race, gender, like anything else you could think of. I mean, and that goes along with the 80s fantasy aesthetic to me. And I feel like I almost don't want to spend too much time talking about it because there's like so much you could say where it was just like, I feel like it'd just be like, in a way the show doesn't, like, it fails, but it doesn't even try. So I feel like it's not even like...
I don't know if I completely agree with that. That I think there are ways in which they did try to have, certainly a more diverse cast than you would have had if you were casting the show in the 80s. And I think that the problematic stuff in the Yennefer storyline is they do, in some ways, I think at least they acknowledge some of that aspect of it. And then they try to like balance certain things out in terms of like how many like naked women they show by like showing, Henry Cavill, as undressed as possible. And again, I'm not saying any of that makes the show good or progressive. I'm just saying, I don't think it's... Right. I just mean that it's not
as undressed as possible.
Trust me, he's not.
I agree.
Undressed as
I simultaneously agree with the statement that it's problematic in a number of ways. But I also think that they did. I suspect they did think about some of these issues, and probably on a lot of them just kind of shrugged and said, "Let's just go with it." But I don't want to sort of dismiss it as retrograde entirely.
I think in some cases, especially with the Yennefer story, they would have had to completely rewrite the source material in order to address some of those issues, and they've chosen not to do that, which is maybe could be justified or not justified, depending on your perspective.
Yeah, well, I mean, the show, I get the feeling that it's pretty faithful to the source material. Just
it is,
for good and for bad. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it would be weird for them to stay so faithful to like include like 50 different kingdoms that the new coming viewer is never going to understand what they are, and like change major aspects of the story otherwise to give it a more kind of contemporary political sensibility. I tend to agree that they're kind of stuck, unless they wanted to, completely like reboot the whole property.
Yeah,
they're kind of stuck telling the story that they had to work with. Yeah. All right, cool. But yeah, so with Yennefer's story though, I mean, the things that I thought were so interesting about it was, I mean, I loved the part where, I guess I'll just say, so she, as Gillian was saying, she kind of like goes and learns magic at this sort of wizard school, basically called Aretuza, and it's very dark. I mean, one of the first scenes that I just absolutely loved was where her classmates get turned into eels to like power the school's magical
push your friend into the pool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was honestly the moment where the show started to really work for me.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Same.
Yeah, so that was fantastic. And then like it's jumping ahead a little bit, but yeah, so she she undergoes this magical transformation where she becomes, much more conventionally attractive and goes out into the world and serves as an advisor to different corrupt, sort of boring, aristocratic families, and then comes back to school as a, after decades, and sort of smokes up with the undergrads. And I just thought like that was such a like interesting. It was so interesting to see that growth of that character, and now she's all, beautiful and powerful and cynical and jaded, and that was the part of the show, I think, and then leading up into the giant like magical siege stuff.
Yeah.
That was the part of the show that really worked for me. Everyone just. Is there just complete consensus on that?
I pretty much agree with that. Yes. My problem, once again, is that, again, the magic and the parameters of the magic are never fully explained. And I feel like half the time I'm like, well, I have no idea why this is happening, but okay, sure. I did a lot of, okay, sure. But it was an exciting battle scene. and watching her hang out. And what'd you say? Smoke it up with the undergrads?
She smoked up. Yeah, they like, she shows them how to mix the herbs,
Yeah.
and then they're all like smoking together and having hallucinations and stuff like that.
Yep. Yeah, all of that was great. I love an angry woman character.
I think the one bit of information we are given about how the magic works, from the first lesson where they're wilting flowers all the way through the final battle, is that magic comes from life, and there needs to be a source for the power that you're using.
Right.
Like we see it in the wilting flowers at the beginning. We also see it when Fringilla's vaporizing her wizards to send fireballs at the defenses.
That was great. Yeah.
Do we see it much in between though? Because as I recall, those are the two instances that we see, and that most of the other magic we see, that there may be some source, but that whatever is happening off screen for that.
Yeah, like when Geralt like force blasts people, or when Yennefer opens up portals, or when she like uses like telekinesis basically to grab the fireball and deflect it away from the city. I don't recall any sort of life wilting at any of that, with any of that stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say to the question about rules is like, I'm somebody who's very happy to sort of go along with a story that doesn't establish rules and is much more sort of dreamlike or kind of random. But I think where that does trip me up is when they very much emphasize a rule and then it sort of seems to be applied very inconsistently, then I'm kind of like, wait, why did we spend time talking about this? And then it seems like there are things breaking the rule.
I think it's very consistently applied in Fringilla's story. We see her, there's the other scene where she guts the guy in order to get information, right?
Yes.
It seems like she is the one who has most consistently applied the things they learned in school, but she is pretty consistently killing people in order to work magic.
Yeah.
And it's funny because she's kind of the outcast by the end of the story, but she's the one who's doing what they've all been taught to do.
Yeah.
I did. The one thing I'll say about that sort of disappointed me is that, so they've had this instructor, Rectoress Tisea de Vries, and she confronts the one. What was the evil one you were just talking about?
Fringilla.
And I was expecting some epic showdown, and Tisea just like went down like with one punch. Like, talk about a glass-jawed wizard, man.
Because they have sorcerer kryptonite in this setting.
Is that what's happening?
What is the sorcerer
That's the
kryptonite?
dust that the dimaterium is the dust that Fringilla blows in her face is like a metal that's like sorcerer kryptonite.
But was Tisea not expecting that might happen?
It seems like the Nilfgaardians use it more than anyone else does. It comes up when they take Mousesack prisoner also, I think.
Yeah, he says
they carry him in a dimaterium wagon.
Right.
And that's why he's weakened and stumbles out. All you need to know about it is that it's sorcerer kryptonite.
I guess. Did anyone ever
But that's another
say
thing that's not
in the show?
I think that's another thing that you have to either know about in advance or else pick up from the dialogue, maybe when they're talking to Mousesack after he stumbles out of the wagon.
I do remember him saying something like, I was going to throw up or something. Like, I got the impression that that's what it was. I don't remember anybody ever saying a name of what the substance was, but I got the gist of it.
What was during the siege, they have these blue crystals in jars that seem to be sort of explosives. Is that something different?
I think that's something different.
Okay. All right. So so I liked the whole wizard battle. And then as I was saying earlier, I mean, I had, mixed feelings because I was confused about that scene where in the first episode where Geralt kills all of Renfri's thugs. But just from a choreography standpoint, that was a totally badass sword
Absolutely.
fight.
Mhm.
Oh man, that was so cool.
It was a fantastic fight. And ending with her, like the fight with her was great too.
Mhm.
So yeah, I don't know. I mean, if I'd made it to that sword fight, that would have definitely encouraged me to keep watching. But I feel like, yeah, there's a good chance if I hadn't been reviewing the show, I wouldn't have even made it that far. But I feel like a sword fight like that, they should have opened the show with something like that, man. That would have totally got me on board with the show, rather than the spider thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they open with.
Sorry, go ahead.
It seems like they're opening with the humor of the show, more than the badassery, right? When he looks at the deer and it's not your day.
That was actually
I
kind
think
of funny because the guy says, do you want some? Was it the tavern keeper says, do you want food? And he's like, I already ate deer.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of underscoring a fundamental difference from the expectation that you might have had going in, that it would be a serious show or that it would be like this big self-serious fantasy epic, right? This is saying right from the beginning that this is a show that doesn't take itself too seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I did think the show was pretty funny, and I thought a lot of the humor worked really well. I wish, but there's a lot of humor in Game of Thrones, and, you can have, like, a show that's funny and that takes itself seriously. Although I did really like the bard guy, Jaskier.
Jaskier.
And I thought that worked really. I thought that because Geralt himself is not that interesting of a character, but then I thought when they sort of buddy him up with Jaskier, that dynamic worked really well because Jaskier is all enthusiastic and everything, and then Geralt's just like no, and I thought that was great.
Yeah, I agree with that. Jaskier is...
He kind of goes from the closed book to the straight man, essentially, in the relationship.
Yeah.
And he's got this bubbly foil to kind of force him to open up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it humanizes him, too. Because, despite the fact that he is annoyed by Jaskier, clearly he likes Jaskier as well.
And he cares about him,
yes.
and he's going to do anything to save him.
Right.
See, Anthony, do you have anything you want to add here?
I agree with everything you just said in terms of like how great it was to have Jaskier in the mix. And I would also say that in general, the show, I think towards the end, it sort of becomes more serious, just in the sense that the plot becomes much more important and there's sort of higher stakes. But overall, I liked the fact that the show didn't have this sort of, or at moments didn't have this sort of weightiness to it that Game of Thrones had. And that's not to say that it's in any way as good as Game of Thrones in its best moments, but just that there's something about just like starting an episode and being like, I don't know where this is going. This is just going to be this kind of dumb, fun adventure that I found really refreshing at this point in time, where like I just felt like when I was watching the final season of Game of Thrones, which I will not spoil for you, David, but like just
don't mention anything after season 4 because I haven't watched it.
Yeah, but I will just, there's this feeling of just everything takes on this extra gravity because of, that it's all kind of like coming to an end, and I didn't hate it as much as other people did, but that coming to something where it was just so free of expectation, and so that maybe it has less to do with the humor, but I think the humor plays a role in it of just like, hey, I just want to watch a show and it's fun and I don't need to cross-examine every element of it. That was a big part of why I think I liked the show, especially early on.
Well, and I guess, the show definitely gets better and better as it goes. And I guess that raises the issue of, by the end of the first season, has it basically solved or at least moved past all the major issues, right? Because the timelines have come together. You kind of know that there's elves and Nilfgaard, and you've sort of sorted out all that stuff. What other, the tone has gotten a little bit more serious and dramatic. I don't know if there's really any big...
Do you think that's an improvement, though?
Yes.
I think it is.
I do. It felt like I said, my first impression of it was, wow, this is a lot more episodic than I expected it to be, which for me felt like a letdown because I was looking for, a long-term arc story. And at the end, it finally felt like we achieved that. And I liked that more.
Yeah, because I just feel like, the first couple episodes, I was kind of like, this could, aside from the visual effects, I feel like this could be slotted right in with one of our awesomely bad 80s fantasy movies channels,
and it looked that way, too, like visually similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the aesthetic.
Oh, the dragon is so 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, and there's just a lot of that. I mean, there's a lot of cheesy 80s fantasy movies. There's a lot of, there's a lot of episodes of Hercules, The Legendary Journey, and Xena Warrior Princess. It's like if you want sort of like cheesy, campy B-movie sword and sorcery, there's a lot of stuff like that. If you want like actual good, sword and sorcery / epic fantasy, there's like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. And that's pretty much it, so, whatever they can do to increase the supply of that, it's just more what I want because you can find campy stuff all over the place.
I think that's a totally fair point, but I do feel like there's this intense pressure towards serialization right now. And so I liked the fact that it resisted that and was episodic at the beginning. And that once we got past, some of the storyline, the early Geralt storylines that didn't work for me, like just, having him encounter this cursed monster in the third episode, and having his whole story like revolve around figuring out how to lift the curse from this monster, I thought like was great. And having some of these other, then there's an episode about this dragon. And so I enjoyed the episodic quality of it again, maybe just in contrast specifically to Game of Thrones. But,
let me just say, I'm not, there's two separate issues, right? There's like episodic versus serialized and sort of goofy versus serious. And I'm advocating more on the goofy versus serious axis. I'm totally fine. It could be as episodic as it wants.
That's fair.
Yeah,
I think somehow there's something
on the other side. I prefer more serial, less episodic, because it did, in fact, what you said, it felt like, Adventures of Hercules or Xena the Warrior Princess, which I don't, I feel like I personally have evolved past it. So,
yeah, and I guess I don't feel that. I guess I felt like there's room for something that is, what if we, took the sort of storytelling approach of a Xena or a Hercules and applied, modern day, production value and effects. And I know some of the effects didn't work for everyone. But, just sort of that still at its heart, it was a bit more of a throwback. And that didn't bother me at all. I understand Dave's point about the amount of great, serious fantasy on television and film is very small. So totally legitimate point. But, it didn't bother me that it was a little bit, that's not what it was going for. Maybe it moves towards that in the end. And I liked the end in a different way, but I appreciated a lot of the beginning for that lightness.
I think that the episodic nature also solves a lot of problems. I think Geralt's story would have looked a lot like series if we'd seen it all playing out in real time, and none of us really liked that. Mm-hmm. Geralt's life is wandering around in the wilderness and gets a job, does job, wanders on to the next town. So I think that, we're hitting the point where the story in the books crosses over to novels from short stories, but I think until these timelines converge, Geralt's life is very episodic by its nature. Mm-hmm. And so I think treating it that way kind of cuts out a lot of the boring stomping through the mud in the wilderness in between.
Well, and that's exactly what I thought the issue was, that this is a product of the source material as opposed to how they felt to do it. So, you've just confirmed it, what my suspicions were on that issue. So, because series story felt the most serialized. Yennefer and, Geralt's is the most episodic, his storyline.
Right. At times it's a literal monster of the week story.
Correct.
And his story is also taking place over a very long span of time.
Right.
Both he and Yennefer are in the neighborhood of 100 years old.
Right.
And so there's a lot of catching up between where those stories start and where Ciri's story, the main timeline, starts.
Right.
Right, but so does everyone feel that it's basically smooth sailing from here on out, or are there still major issues that people have with the show going into season 2?
I don't have any major issues, and I'm certainly all set to watch the second season. So, like I said, I took all of the issues that I had with it, and I kind of just went, okay, whatever, I don't care. It's entertaining, and for me, if it's entertaining, I will come back again.
Yeah, I feel a little bit hypocritical after my the Mandalorian panel, where I was basically saying the exact opposite of what I'm saying now, where it's like, oh, it's fun, it's serialized, it's silly, like, just enjoy it. Yeah, so I guess, I don't know, I just thought it's like The Witcher, he's like all dressed in black, and I don't know, I just expected it's going to be like dark, and, I don't know. Isn't it supposed to be, because he fights monsters, he's got a silver sword and all this stuff, I don't know, it just seems like a grimdark, like an inherently grimdark property to me, not a...
Did you feel like it had gotten grimdark enough by the end of the season for you?
Yeah, at the part where Fringilla is like turning her fellow wizards into artillery bombs, like that was like the level of darkness I wanted the whole show to have. But it definitely, it doesn't need to be any darker than that. That's a perfect level of darkness as far as I'm concerned.
I guess I would counter that. To me, it was like there's something about it that's inherently silly. That it's a guy who straps a sword to his shoulder and is Henry Cavill, in his most buff mode, wearing, a not particularly convincing wig, going from town to town fighting monsters. On some level, treating it too seriously is to misunderstand the concept.
I think that the humor and lightness combined with the grimdark aspects is what makes it's an essential part of the game. In particular, you have this kind of apocalyptic plot and this grimdark world, but there's also a lot of moments where you come to a village and everyone's been turned into pigs and you have to turn them back into people. It's kind of this balance of grimdark and fantasy nonsense that makes for a different mix, I think, than you see in a novel that's grimdark all the way through.
Actually, speaking of Henry Cavill's extraordinary buffness, I wanted to ask...
Yes, please, let's talk about
I wanted to
Henry
ask
Cavill's extreme...
Gillian, because one of these interviews or something I listened to, they mentioned that in the books, Geralt is described as being not that good looking, in contrast to Henry Cavill, who looks like he was like engineered in a lab to be like a real man that you would look up in the dictionary or like look up in the encyclopedia. So I'm just curious, like, how much does Henry Cavill's preternatural gorgeousness match the description of the character in the book?
The thing that about the character in the show that is very Geralt to me is that every single episode somebody tells him he smells.
Yeah.
And I think that...
And he takes so many baths, too. You can't win.
And yet he goes and soaks in monster guts in between.
Right.
I think
we see the one bath he takes every year.
There's only one bath. Was there more than one? Did I miss a bath? I think there was...
No, there's a bath before Calanthe's banquet and also the bath at Yennefer's.
Yeah, that one, that's the one I'm talking about.
Is it 2 baths in one episode?
How did I miss
Are those
that?
the same episode? They might be.
I think they're one episode apart.
No, one episode apart. One's episode 4 and episode 5 he bathes.
But getting back to does it match the character in the book? Like what he looks like?
I mean, he's not an unattractive guy in the game. In the books, he's definitely more on the, creepy guy skulking in the alley sort of scale. And people it's hard for me to say whether I think he is explicitly described as ugly a number of times, but I think a lot of it is people reacting to him as a non-human. And a lot of it is people being revolted by the idea of him. He's kind of this, he's the plumber who goes and removes the nasty problem from your drain, right? And they're treating him like this kind of underclass of people who solve your nasty monster problems, but you don't really want to interact with otherwise.
One of these YouTube videos I watched, again, this is sort of a confrontational title, but it's called The Witcher and Plagiarism. But it's basically comparing Geralt to Elric of Melniboné and noting a number of very, very, very striking parallels. I don't...
the whiteness, definitely.
Well, yeah, and I don't generally tend to care if something is like similar to something else. I mean, everything you could come up with is similar to something, but it is there are kind of a lot of interesting parallels. Yeah, they're both albinos. Elric has red eyes and Geralt has yellow eyes. They're both called the White Wolf. They both belong to they're both part of a culture, like in one case the Witchers, in the other case the aristocracy of Melniboné, that's very cold and emotionless, and they're the one person in their order or whatever who has feelings and a moral center and stuff.
I don't think that's true of Geralt, though, at all, or of the other Witchers, which is definitely getting ahead of ourselves because...
Are you saying this YouTube video is not fully accurate?
Well, I'm saying that the thing about Witchers have no emotions... I think it's fairly clear that this is a myth that is told about Witchers, but it's not necessarily actually
It's part
true.
of the prejudice against them.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that when we do get to meet the other Witchers, that it'll be clear that Geralt is not necessarily an exception.
Interesting. I only read one of the Elric books, and it was a long time ago. I don't know if anyone else has ever read them.
I had them all and I never read them. I couldn't get into it for some reason.
Yeah, I haven't read them. I mean, I feel like people talk about Elric, though, as if he is one of the sort of classic sword and sorcery archetypes. So it'd be sort of strange, I guess maybe I'm just reacting to the fact they use plagiarism, which seems like such a strong word for it. But like, I feel like you were saying, like a lot of stuff, is not wholly original, but borrows or comments on, and it wouldn't surprise me if that was maybe something that was in the author's mind.
I mean, one thing, apparently Netflix came out and said that this is the most popular Netflix show ever, I think.
Really?
First season. They said most popular first season launch.
Okay. What does everyone think about that? Does that surprise you?
I found that utterly mystifying.
Okay.
I mean, I like it. I don't think...
a little strange.
But I'm just like, why this?
That doesn't strike me as strange at all, actually, because the IP issue, which is why everybody's making adaptations. And its IP, its origins are not just a novel or series of novels, but a game as well. So you're hitting two, maybe in some cases overlapping communities, but also there's the separate people who just play the games or the people who just read the books. So that doesn't surprise me at all. You're bringing a lot of eyes from two different communities.
But I feel like I don't know the numbers, but I feel like The Witcher 3.
Nobody knows the numbers. Netflix doesn't.
No, I'm not talking about. Sorry, I'm not talking about. I'm talking about the sales of the books and of the games. I mean, I feel like The Witcher 3 is like a pretty well-known game, but it's not like Call of Duty or something. And I feel like the books are like reasonably well known among fantasy authors, but fantasy readers, but aren't, Wheel of Time or Game of Thrones or something. So I it's hard for me to believe that just like existing fans of the IP by themselves.
And I've seen a lot of people saying that they had never.
I had never. And
I'm unfamiliar with either.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But also, I think you have to also...
in this room, I'm the only one who's...
Yes, you are.
But I also think you have to take a poll, and we can extrapolate from that how many people have played the games. It's like 75% of people haven't. So.
Yeah.
But I think you have to take into account the fact that Game of Thrones, one of the most popular shows in the history of television, just ended, and people are looking for that next fix.
Yeah, see, that sounds more of an explanation to me. Yeah. But then this isn't but then this is so not Game of Thrones. But apparently, and that sort of disappointed me. But apparently, it's not disappointing a lot of people.
Yeah, I don't think it benefits from that context, because I think it's a different flavor of thing.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it benefited just from the sense of it probably got people to take a look, but that's probably the wrong expectation to have going into it.
Yeah.
But that's kind of because I heard the writer, or the showrunner say that like a lot of people went in expecting Game of Thrones and kind of didn't like the show because it wasn't Game of Thrones. So that's kind of an interesting issue, though, is if people weren't comparing it to Game of Thrones, maybe nobody would have watched it in the first place. And if they do compare it to Game of Thrones, a lot more people watch it, and some percentage of them are like, hey, this isn't Game of Thrones. This isn't what I was promised. But then there's enough people who are like, this isn't Game of Thrones, but I like this,
Yeah.
Right.
that
maybe the Game of Thrones comparison is, redounding to its benefit, even if it's not really that accurate or.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that sort of the bet I think that a lot of times marketers are making when they take something and they say, oh, it's like this other thing you like, and that may be not entirely true, but the hope is that, well, you'll like this enough, or you'll have tuned in or bought the ticket at that point, so it's fine if we, don't have a completely accurate comparison, but it's close enough that people aren't totally furious.
And maybe
it's called a bait and switch, I think.
Well, bait and switch is when it goes wrong, and then if it goes right, you're like, oh, this is like different from I expected, but I liked it just as much.
And maybe partly because there is so little fantasy on television, the Game of Thrones comparison happens because there isn't much else to compare it to.
Yeah.
And people are kind of discovering that there are more flavors of fantasy that they could be enjoying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and certainly if this is as big a success as Netflix is claiming, I mean, I certainly hope it leads to more fantasy properties being developed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's also interesting that, I mean, I think many more people know this from the game than from the books. And video game adaptations into film or TV have like an unbelievably checkered
oh, God,
history.
yeah.
You could just say bad. I think you can just say bad.
I'm trying to think if there's any good ones. Like, nothing comes to
aren't.
mind immediately. Although
I have
Sonic
a weird
the Hedgehog...
soft spot for Prince of Persia, but I'm not. That's not a hill I'm going to die on. I'm just going to say that I enjoyed watching on a plane one time. That's all.
Visually fun, but it's so problematic in so many ways. It was on recently, and I sat and watched it, and I was like, "Wow, this is worse than I remember."
Yeah, although Sonic the Hedgehog, February 21st or something, that's going to redeem all video game adaptations. But
I don't know if I'm going to hold my breath for that one.
But yeah, so in a way, it's almost too bad that this isn't just a video game adaptation, because it would be like the first successful video game adaptation ever. But it's kind of a video game adaptation. I mean, they said that I think they only had the rights to the books. But like, I think Henry Cavill is
Cavill's
a huge
Geralt
fan
is
of
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't his costume look I don't know how detailed the description is in the books, but isn't his costume basically exactly like the game?
It's pretty close. Although the rest of the costumes aren't at all.
Uh-huh. So I came across a article. I guess this is potentially a little spoilerish. There was just an announcement Netflix made about season 2. So I guess if you're super, sensitive about spoilers and you don't want to hear Netflix confirming something about season 2, stop listening now. But they said that, okay, I'm going to give you another second to like get to your computer or iPad or whatever turned off. But yeah, so they said that Vesemir is going to show up in season 2.
Mm-hmm.
So who is Vesemir, and how excited should I be that he's going to show up in season 2?
So Vesemir is Geralt's mentor. He's an older Witcher who's been around the block. He does the training of the Witchers. And I think they've also announced that the upcoming animated movie is going to be his backstory. So that should be interesting.
I heard there was a fan petition for them to cast Mark Hamill as Vesemir.
I did see that online on Twitter.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think somebody asked him on Twitter, and he said, "Oh yeah, sure," but he had no idea what they were talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know how likely that it actually is to be. Is Vesemir Luke Skywalker? Probably not. But he is. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed.
Wait, so he said sure without knowing who the... So he just accepts
joking around.
He needs the work, I guess, or he just accepts any...
Well, he said sure to somebody on Twitter. That's not the same thing as saying sure to a casting agent.
Yeah.
I don't know how serious that suggestion actually is. I wouldn't be surprised if it's somebody else entirely.
Yeah. So are there any... So, we mentioned Geralt has all these crazy adventures he goes on in this season. I'm just wondering if any of them stick out in anyone's mind as particularly good or particularly unfortunate. I'm trying to... Let's see. We had the one with the dragons. We had the princess who was turned into like a zombie monster. We had the genie. I don't know. Any... Andrea, which Geralt adventures stick out in your mind, either good or pro or con?
Not all of them seem a little goofy to me, because that was the basis of one of my problems in the episodic nature of it, in that he's running around killing monsters, which I get, that's what he does, but that seemed the goofiest part of the whole thing to me. So I was just like, all right, I can clearly see that none of this is going to actually affect the overarching story of the story. So I'm just going to roll along with it and just accept it. But none of it stuck with me in any particularly favorable way.
Anthony?
I would go with the one that I already mentioned, which is the episode 3 story, which is the monster that is the cursed princess, and so it sets up this situation where the Geralt basically has to fight but not kill this monster all through the night until dawn. And I just thought that was just a really, really great setup of a constraint for your hero, so he can't just do the obvious thing. And it also felt like it added an interesting dimension to the character that he, not that this is particularly complex, but it just, to see a degree of his heroism, that he was willing to do that he wanted to do that, made me like him more. And I thought just in terms of the way they shot that scene, where for the longest time, you just didn't see the creature. You just heard people talking about it. And then when it finally comes on camera, way, way into this episode, I thought it looked great and was genuinely a well-designed, terrifying looking monster. And so I would say almost everything about that storyline for me worked really well.
I think I agree with that. I think that's the most successful of the monsters. And it's the most complete and coherent as a story. I think because it is a fairly simple story.
Yeah, I found that monster pretty unsettling in contrast to several of the other ones. Yeah, because I would say I didn't like the CGI spider in scene 1. The genie thing seems kind of weird.
The genie thing was inexplicable to me.
Granting wishes. Granting wishes. That just seems like something out of a completely different story to me. Gillian, what do you think? Is capturing genies and getting them to grant you wishes, do you think that fits into the rest of the Witcher milieu?
Oh, I think they had to include that one because it's such a key component of backstory between Geralt and Yennefer, but I'm not sure that story by itself holds up.
Yeah, what did everyone think about where the guy turned out to be the golden dragon? That seemed pretty weird to me.
That didn't bother me.
It was fine.
I think that's pretty well telegraphed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The dragon itself was maybe disappointing, but I think it's another glimpse at Geralt's principles, and that he's saying all the way through, I don't kill dragons. And then it becomes clear why this guy sought him out in particular.
Yeah.
Okay, but see,
it did seem like the Golden Dragon's plan was really bad because
that's what I was about to say.
it was about like this idea of, well, I'm going to get this guy who will never kill a dragon to come with me on this dragon killing mission, and then I'll change his mind at the end. But like that, he wouldn't have gone on the mission at all if Yennefer hadn't been there.
Well, he's essentially bringing Geralt as backup because he's going on the mission because he knows people are going to go try to kill this dragon, and he wants to stop them. And he's recruiting Geralt as his insurance in case something goes awry.
Right, but the plan is like he's going to convince Geralt to go kill the dragon and then just assume that Geralt's going to show up before the Reavers and then decide to fight them. It seems like a better thing would be like, hey, I'm a gold dragon. Could you help protect this egg? And here, I'll fly you up to the cave.
But gold dragons are a myth.
To make sure that we get there before the Reaver. You know what I'm saying? Like, it seems like a very like Rube Goldberg sort of plan.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, if I was,
there is also an awkward moment in that episode where the gold dragon character, he's fallen off the path, and he's like, "Yes, you must let go and sacrifice us." And then he lets go, but then his bodyguard is still on the chain, and you're not really sure. I mean, later on you realize, oh well, she knew probably that he was going to turn into the dragon and fly away. But it's like she never says like, oh yeah, you should definitely let go of the chain. You shouldn't try to rescue me or anything. And Geralt like just is like, oh, sorry, I'm going to let go of this chain and let you die. And, and obviously the fact that, she's a, black character as well makes it kind of, the dynamics of that scene were kind of weird.
Yeah. And I think that fake out's another bad adaptation of the source material. I think that in the story, they're just killed, or is supposedly killed by a landslide. There's none of this don't let go nonsense.
Yeah, and the whole thing with Dara, who seems to devote himself to Ciri for no apparent reason that I can see, and risk his life over and over for her and stuff. That also like was sort of that same annoying trope to me, and I think it came up maybe even one more time in this season, but yeah. So like we said.
Dara at least has a healthy sense of self-preservation.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So we're pretty much running short on time here. Anyone have any other subjects about The Witcher Season 1 that they want to bring up?
I really like the music.
Oh, we should say, I guess that the that Throw a Coin to Your Witcher or whatever song is swept the internet. A few people have been following.
Which I find mystifying. Again,
I think it's just that song.
Just that song. It's a real brain
I don't think
eater.
anything. Yeah, and I don't think anything else made that kind of impression on me.
Yeah.
Apparently, they put out a soundtrack.
Yeah.
But for me, it was more just the regular orchestral score, which I found like very compelling and memorable.
See, I almost forgot. So, Anthony, you sent around this link to a bizarre interview with the author of these books.
I saw that. A lot of people were tweeting it. It's awesome.
Do you want to, Anthony? Do you want to just explain that?
Yeah, it was, again, I just thought it was like funny and delightful. So I don't actually know how to pronounce the writer's name. Is it Andrzej?
As far as I can tell, it's basically Andrew, and then the W has a V sound. So, Sapkowski, I think. I'm not. Okay. It's something like that.
But it was just where he was very gruff in answering certain questions in a way that I found very likable. I think the answer I remember most vividly was they asked him how he felt about the fact that they were basically printing new editions of the Witcher books, and to the tune of hundreds of thousands of copies. How did he feel about that? And he said, well, how am I supposed to answer that question? My emotions about that were, you can probably guess what my emotions were, and they were not particularly complicated.
Well, it doesn't, I should have, he said something like, what would you expect me to do? Cry? Like,
yeah.
Yeah, they're selling hundreds of thousands of copies of my book. What do you think? But yeah, it's like I guess it was over email, it wasn't a phone conversation or anything. And the answers are like, I guess, he's making so much money off of this, like he doesn't care anymore. He can just say whatever he wants. But yeah.
No, I like the part where they asked him if if he had anything to do with the store, and he's like, no, I don't really like to work. That would have required me to work, and I really just don't like to work.
Yeah, well, it says, I do not like working too hard or for too long, is the headline of the article, yeah. Well, they also say, like, what did you think of the show? And he says, I would have to be stupid to answer that question.
Yes, yeah.
So, yeah, if anyone wants to check that out, it's over on Gizmodo. All right, cool. So we're out of time. So let's get some final thoughts. So, Anthony, final thoughts on Netflix's The Witcher.
I really enjoyed it. I think it's sort of a rough start, but overall, I think it's a really fun show, and I think it's a goofy show, but in a very good way.
Andrea, final thought.
Not groundbreaking television, not brilliant writing, but thoroughly enjoyable, and I will definitely come back for season 2. Looking forward to it, in fact.
And Gillian, final thought.
I definitely had fun. I think it was stronger in some axes than others, but definitely a solid start, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, and
I want my grown-up Siri.
Yeah, and just for all my friends I mentioned who gave up on this after, in the first episode, I hear where you're coming from, but because I felt the same way as I said, but it does get better and better. So I saw some people suggesting you should just skip to episode 4. I don't know.
Oh, then you'll be even more lost.
Yeah,
Right.
So what you should do is you should just read all 7 books and then skip to episode 4, just to make it easier on yourself. But yeah, I mean, like, and there's just, as I said, there's so little good epic fantasy / sword and sorcery that, it's worth giving this one a try, even if it doesn't grab you off the bat. Because by the end, I thought it was pretty compelling, and I'll give season 2 a try. All right, cool. So all right, let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Anthony Ha, Andrea Kail, and Gillian Conahan. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Anthony Ha, Andrea Kail, and Gillian Conahan for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.